This is a wonderful show. I got to see it and actually do a little work on it for the Harn in Gainesville, Florida. And in the process of doing this, it has advanced my thinking about the three things that are up in my title. First of all, I'm very interested, having done work on both Mary Cassatt and Maurice Prendergast, on the relationship between French and American art. And secondly, working on this show, getting to know a little bit more about Monet and his particular relationship to American art. And finally, this concept of light. When Harry asked me for a title for this talk, I was building on a talk that I gave in Gainesville last spring. We had a symposium, and it was about French and American light. And I wanted to build on that and grow from that, so I guess basically tossed out the title Modern Light. And after I did that, I thought, oh dear, I don't even know what modern light means. I mean, have you ever done that? You know, somebody says, what are you going to talk about, or what are you going to do? And you just say something, and then you have to figure out what that actually means. So that's really what we're going to be doing tonight. It's a bit of a journey to figure out, is there such a thing as modern light? I mean, after all, light is light, right? I mean, light is immutable. Light is fundamental. And, you know, if you go back to Michelangelo, light is definitely something that artists have thought about for a good long time. I mean, the Sistine ceiling is based on the book of Genesis and the acts of creation. And if you think about light, now most people don't know the section on light in the Sistine ceiling very well, because it's relatively simple. It's just, you know, God up here, and you know, we are in a church, right? So here he is, and you're seeing the underneath of his beard, white beard here, and he is creating light. And this is the text. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. Simple, right? Simple. Light, dark. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. So not only is this fundamental, eternal, from the beginning, light, but it also generates that other immutable principle of nature, which is time. Day, night, morning, evening. These are immutable, fundamental, natural concepts. And artists throughout time, I mean, look at Michelangelo, struggling to picture this act of creating light. But, you know, think of all your favorite artists who have dealt with light. Vermeer, for instance, always comes to my mind. Or Rembrandt, you know, the whole Baroque period. And then light in the 18th century, Fragonard, the Barbizon school, for instance. But when you get to the Impressionists, there is something that strikes you as modern. I mean, if you say modern light about these paintings, nobody quibbles. It's like, oh, right, that's modern light. All of a sudden, where you would think, can there be such a thing as old light and new light? Can there be such a thing as modern light and old-fashioned light? Well, yeah, I mean, perhaps so. And that struck people from the very beginning. There was a critic, a writer named Edmond Duranty, who wrote one of the most complete and important texts on Impressionism and published it in 1876. And he said that the Impressionists, as far as the method of coloring is concerned, they have made a real discovery. This is new, whose origin cannot be found elsewhere, neither with the Dutch, Vermeer, Rembrandt, etc., nor in the pale tones of fresco painting, nor in the light tonalities of the 18th century, Fragonard, for instance, Chardin. Their discovery actually consists in having recognized that full light decolors tones, that the sun, reflected by objects, tends, because of its brightness, to bring them back to that luminous unity which melts its 7 prismatic rays, prism rays, into a single colorless radiance, light, color light, together, through the prism. Proceeding from intuition to intuition, they have little by little succeeded in breaking down sunlight into its rays, its elements, and to reconstitute its unity by means of the general harmony of spectrum colors, which they spread on their canvases. The most learned physicist could find nothing to criticize in their analyses of light. So, from Duranty, we're suddenly into the modern age of science, of studying light via lenses, prisms, understanding the spectrum. But before we get to that, there's another 19th century modern technology that is the sine qua non of Impressionist painting, which had just recently been perfected, and that was cast plate glass. Perfected by a Scottish glassmaker in 1848, it was almost immediately taken up by Sir James Paxton for the Crystal Palace, which was the centerpiece, the home, the exhibit hall of the World's Fair of 1851 in London. So, by mid-century, there is an inexpensive, strong, architectural quality glass that transforms the way architects build their buildings. Sir James Paxton used it all over the place. The whole building is glass. It's ridiculous. But suddenly, particularly in urban areas, architects were able to create inexpensive, it's not that people didn't have glass in their windows before. It was just so expensive that it had to be, and so fragile, that it had to be used sparingly. If you think of Louis XIV's Hall of Mirrors, for instance, the glass, both in the windows and the mirrors of that gallery, was the most expensive architectural element used in that building. Only the wealthiest could afford that extensive a use of glass. But suddenly, in the mid-19th century, it was available practically to all. But, and its cognate, the mirror, suddenly with cast plate glass, where you could have strong, large-scale panes of glass, you could silver the back of it and put mirrors all over your house if you wanted to. It could be everywhere. So windows and mirrors allow us to look at this light in a new way. It was Paris that was the city that was able to take advantage of this new architectural element for two reasons. One was that Napoleon III was redoing Paris. This was the time of Haussmannization, where the old medieval sectors of Paris were being torn down to make the large boulevards. Whole new blocks of apartment buildings were being built, so they could use this new technology for their urban living. We still call them French windows or French doors. These large windows were transformative. And for artists, now artists typically splurged on large windows in their studios, and to be very practical, it was usually the skylight above their heads so that the light could come all day long if you had it above you, had the window above you. But now, in these Parisian apartments, artists could have their studios in any room of the house. They could go from room to room to room, and they did, as you can see in these portraits, particularly Renoir's portrait of Monet. You could also go from room to room to room and look out. Suddenly Paris, if you were an artist and all you had was a skylight, you weren't seeing a whole lot from your studio. But after mid-century, and the second reason was the Franco-Prussian War. I forgot to get the second reason, but there was so much rebuilding in Paris after the 1860s and 1870s that the artists that we know lived in these new style apartments. And again, to quote from Duranty, he says, "From within, we communicate with the outside through a window, and the window is the frame that ceaselessly accompanies us. The window frame, depending upon whether we are near or far, seated or standing, cuts off the external view in the most unexpected, most changeable way, obtaining for us that eternal variety and unexpectedness, which is one of the great delights of reality." So something so humble as a window could have all of this philosophical meaning, and particularly for Impressionism, which we know of as a style that really took advantage of movement and seeing in its unexpectedness a reality that it was always out there, but we hadn't quite seen before. Mary Cassatt and Edgar Degas, you could argue, were actually using windows and mirrors as their subjects. When you look at Degas' rehearsal of the ballet, for instance, the dancers are all crowded over on the side. It's the windows that are in the center. Those are the main subject of this. In Mary Cassatt's work, you may not see this right away, but this lump on the back of her head is actually a mirror that is reflecting her elaborate hairdo. And all of this, you see back here, is a mirror. To be able to put mirrors that extensively in the Paris Opera House or any theater was unheard of until now. And then finally, the third use of glass in the 19th century that was constantly being perfected by scientists and in new technology was the lens. Lenses of all kinds, telescopes, binoculars, glasses, microscopes. All of these, through principles of the prism, were bending light and allowing you to see more. The concept of bending light is called refraction, and anything as simple as a glass of water can cause that phenomenon where the light, you can see from the stripes in the back, are being bent as you look at them through the glass itself. Or a prism can be constructed to bend light in a certain way so that you see only part of the spectrum. All of this was being experimented with by the physicists, the scientists, the light scientists of the day. Particularly in France. One of the great physicists in light, the study of light, was Léon Foucault, who was fundamental in the understanding of light as light waves and measuring the speed of light. All of these experiments were being done by physicists. And in a French context, so that light was so important a cultural concept that they even had a particular word for it, which we don't quite understand because it's not translatable the way you would think. The word is optique, which, you would think is just plain optic, the eye, being able to, because light is nothing without the eye, of course, so the studies go hand in hand. But optique in French cultural studies actually meant point of view, not just the eye as a universal receptor, but that everyone's eye received light in a slightly different way. And so writers, Zola, Flaubert, used this term optique to describe their new realist style of literature, that they were seeing things in a new way, in their own way, their point of view. It was definitely light. France owned light in the third quarter of the 19th century. Americans did not. The term Impressionism for Americans came almost immediately after it was coined in 1874. Throughout the 1870s, if you read criticism, read reviews of shows, if you read about artists, many of them are called Impressionists. But the connection between what the Americans considered Impressionism and what the French considered Impressionism, those were two different things. American critics didn't even consider Impressionism French particularly. Whistler was considered an American Impressionist, and Whistler did most of his work in England. And although Whistler has the kind of spontaneity that we associate with Impressionism, if you remember Ruskin's criticism of Whistler's paintings, that he's throwing a pot of paint in the public's face. This was what people associated with Impressionism, but it was without the light that we saw in French Impressionist painting. I'm just going through a number of artists that you may never have heard of, but were considered Impressionists by American art critics, by the American art world in the 1870s. Mariano Fortuny, who was a Spanish painter who lived in Rome, lived in Italy, and exhibited in Paris, was collected avidly by New Yorkers as an example of an Impressionist artist. People like Robert Bloom, who was American, followed in the footsteps of Fortuny, and even Homer, to a certain extent, knew Fortuny's work and raised his own watercolors to a higher key in reference to Fortuny. Since Impressionism was often associated with sketches and works on paper, watercolors like this were considered by many American critics to be Impressionist. Monticelli, Adolphe Monticelli, who was French, even though he has this Italian last name, was a friend of the Barbizon painters. Had nothing to do with the Impressionist group, but he was considered to be an Impressionist and was promoted by this gallery, Cotier and Company. Actually, it's Cotier and Company, not French. Looks French, not French. He was actually from Scotland, but had a gallery in New York, was promoting Monticelli as an Impressionist. In the 1879 Society of American Artists exhibition, which was the modern art exhibition in New York in 1879, the Munich school, Trachtmann, Chase, and Courier were considered to be Impressionists. German, training in German. So in the 1870s, Americans there were many things about Impressionism that Americans were looking for, but light was not one of them. Monet had an exhibition in New York in 1879, and people, although they considered him the leader of the Impressionists, also saw a very different kind of style. And someone like J. Alden Weir, who is in the exhibition, followed in Manet's footsteps and was the one who, because of his residence in Paris, got Manet's placed in American collections, like the Irwin Davis collection. But in Paris in 1879, the one American who was interested in light was Mary Cassatt. And it was at this moment, this was the very first time that the New York Times reviewed an Impressionist exhibition. The 1879 Impressionist exhibition was the fourth. They had been going on since 1874, and not a mention in American, and the American newspapers were very, very aware of what was going on in Paris, but they did not review an Impressionist exhibition until 1879, and I don't think that's by accident. I think it was because Mary Cassatt was in that exhibition. That was her first Impressionist exhibition, and she was well known by the critics of the New York Times. So she's gathering American attention to what is going on in Impressionism. And from this point on, not only, okay, so France owns light in the 1870s, Americans do not, but at this point in 1879, all of a sudden, France starts funneling it to the United States. Light gets exported to the US. And I mean that literally. One of the greatest exports, artistic exports from France, was the Statue of Liberty. An amazing enterprise, instigated by the sculptor Bartholdi, who got this idea that he could get the French and American public together to fund this enormous statue that would stand in New York Harbor that would be entitled Liberty Enlightening the World. Its reference, liberty, is to slavery. This is post-Civil War. And so the French, although they were ambivalent about slavery, the French, like the English, were getting rich off of American cotton. But French intellectuals, anyway, were on the side of emancipation, as was Bartholdi. And so his idea was to present this Statue of Liberty as a commemoration of emancipation in the United States, and to use light to signify freedom or liberty. In preparation for this, and from when it was green-lighted, this project in 1875, from 1875 until the time that the statue was actually erected in New York Harbor, which was in 1886, it was all about fundraising, because this was not a government-sponsored project. This was all to be funded by individuals. So in the United States, he created the torch, which was shown first in the centennial, in 1876 in Philadelphia, the centennial of the American Revolution. It was on the grounds of that fair. That was a great fair in Philadelphia. And then when the fair was over, it was moved to New York, to Madison Square, where it stood for until 1882, when it was taken down and sent back to Paris to be put on the sculpture itself. So these were, people could go into these and pay an admission fee and go up into the torch. And to complete the metaphor, the torch, of course, producing light, it was an observation deck so that people could see, not, see the light, see light and observation. In Paris, the same thing. In 1878, the head was on view in that World's Fair of 1878. Also fundraising. Finally, it was nearing completion in 1884 and was dedicated in 1886. So the fundraising, the French were responsible for paying for the sculpture itself, the figure, which was being done in Paris by Bartholdi. The Americans were responsible for the pedestal, which is huge. I mean, look at it. It's practically as high as the sculpture itself. All of this. And it was immensely expensive. The whole thing was, I can't even imagine it being done today, this project, raising all of this money from individuals, not from, there were some wealthy people, but mostly from, donations of school children and that sort of thing. But in order to raise money for the pedestal, one of the things that they did was hold art exhibitions. And this one was held in 1883. The pedestal, this is what it was called, the Statue of Liberty Pedestal Art Loan Exhibition. And from this moment, as part of this amazing cultural episode, it was modern art that was associated with liberty enlightening the world. So light, liberty, and modern art were fused at this time. The two Monets that Weir had helped Davis acquire and were in New York were in that exhibition. Louisine Havemeyer owned this Degas, which was in the exhibition. And from this moment, from now on, you get this phenomenal collecting of Impressionist work by American collectors. Louisine Havemeyer led the way, and of course Mary Cassatt is in Paris, advocating for this. Louisine Havemeyer eventually owned 30 Monets, but this was the first one that she bought. She owned the Degas, and Mary Cassatt's brother, Alexander Cassatt, was also amassing a collection of Impressionist work thanks to her. People thought that her brother, because he became so wealthy when he became the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, thought that he made her wealthy. And she always said, no. I made him much wealthier than he made me because I bought all these Impressionist paintings for him back when they were affordable. So, American collectors. So, the French are exporting light to the U.S., and the Americans are accepting it, are taking it, are participating in this import-export process. In 1886 was the first major Impressionist exhibition in New York, organized by Durand-Ruel, the dealer, who was promoting Impressionism. It was the moment when the concepts of Impressionism finally crystallized in the eyes of the American art world. And one of the reasons was this painting here, the Seurat, which we think of as we don't think of Seurat and New York in the same sentence, the same breath. But this was the work that caught everyone's attention, partly because it was so big, but also because Seurat was already beginning that odd, what seemed to the Americans to be of that odd pointillist technique, but this was light and color at its height. Monet, however, benefited from this. Monet was the one, so Seurat was getting all this attention from this weird painting of bathers. In comparison, Monet seemed sane, seemed like this is really how the light and color concept should come across. And I'm showing you here 3 versions of his very famous Woman with the Parasol. One, the original one, which was done in 1875 on the right, and then 2 versions that he did in 1886, the year of this exhibition, which show him looking at light and color in a more scientific, more systematic way. American critics loved it. Loved Monet. This is a newspaper article from 1890. Each step of the race forward must be taken by the adventurous in order that after years of urging, the humdrum world may follow and applaud. These men bid us behold ecstatic colors in nature, light flashing with prismatic hues, shadows glowing with the deep brilliancy of jewels. They tell us that nature is all color and it knows nothing of black and white, that the lavishness of its splendors has dulled our purblind eyes and veiled the keen vision of art. They show us that grays are but the meeting place of blues and reds, yellows and purples, that darkness is as full of color as light, and they strive through a reverent open-air study of nature to attain its results in its own way. I mean, this was glowing. This was the triumph of Monet. And in fact, critics went on to say, you know, Monet isn't really appreciated in Paris. It's here in New York that we really appreciate Monet. They don't understand. All of a sudden, you know, Paris, which was truly the capital of modern art, American critics are saying, you know, actually, it's the Americans who appreciate new ideas, who appreciate experimentation. And Monet is the prophet Muhammad, who's not appreciated in Mecca, so he's coming to New York, which is the new Medina. And in fact, as it turns out, more Monets were sold to American collectors during Monet's lifetime than any other nationality, and that, of course, includes the French. This was truly, you can see why people said this is his home. This is the home of this new style that is so revolutionary and so important to the way we see the world. Now, going back to Paris, we think, okay, this is really modern art. This is French modern art. These American critics don't know what they're talking about. It's really in France, in Paris, where it's all happening. The thing about Seurat is, his style was the most radical interpretation of the light and color relationship. But oddly enough, he gets his idea about this mixing of colors through dabs of paint from an American, not a painter, but a physicist, Ogden Rood, whose book, Modern Chromatics, was published in 1879 and translated into French and published in France in 1881. And it was Rood that Seurat references in his writings. And it was Rood, there were many color theorists and many French color theorists, but the American Rood contributed the idea that as a physicist, light is color. And to mix colors, you mix lights. You have a red light and a green light, and you mix those lights, and you see what you come up with. And what Rood said, because Rood was also a painter, studied in Munich, he said, you have to think of paint not as a substance, not as something hard and tangible, but as light. And if you put a red dab of paint on your canvas, and you put a green dab of paint on your canvas, those are actually two lights, two colored lights, just like the physicists were using in their studios to try to understand the relationship between colors and light and how to mix them. So it was Rude who said, don't mix the red and the green, or something more logical. Not that you would mix red and green, but yellow and blue. You put the yellow and blue side by side, and because they are light hitting your eye, they will mix and create green. Americans. Edison, speaking of light, speaking of modern light, the electric light bulb, which he perfects in 79, gets a patent for in 80, and in 1881, is asked by the city of Paris to come and put electric lights into the Paris Opera. So this exporting light from France to America is now going the other way. American light going to France, going to Paris, creating new ideas. But above it all stands Monet, and particularly when all of this American influence starts coming into Paris vis-a-vis light and vis-a-vis color, Monet was the one that they went to see. Monet, there were already all of these Monets in New York. So when artists were going from New York, were going to France, they knew him. They knew his name. They wanted to go and learn the new style from him. And so they progressed, they did their pilgrimages to Giverny. And of course, look at the huge windows in Monet's studio. And that's one of the things that he did when he bought the house in Giverny, was to enlarge the windows, make it brighter inside the house. Two important American artists, painters who went to Giverny are related to this theme. One is Ogden Rude's son, Roland Rude, who was a painter, who was also a scientist, but he, like his father, was a painter as well. So if there's any question that Monet wouldn't have known the American Ogden Rude, he certainly knew the son, Roland Rude, and it was Roland Rude who wrote to his father and said, in Giverny, people carry your book around as if it were the Bible. It was that important and that influential. And on the right is a photograph by Theodore Robinson of Monet, one of the most compelling and direct photographs of Monet ever taken. It's hard to find good photographs of Monet, but Theodore Robinson managed to do this. He was a good photographer, he was a painter, of course, and he got to be the American who was friendliest with Monet. So there was, you feel, a kind of connection between the two of them. Robinson could not have been more enamored or appreciative. Enamored is not a good word. Respectful of Monet. And Monet and Robinson was asked to write an article on Monet for the Century magazine that came out in 1892. So, highest praise. And he's talking about Impressionists, and he says, of them all, Monsieur Claude Monet is the most aggressive, forceful painter, the one whose work is influencing the epoch, this era, the most. If he has not, as Monsieur Guy de Maupassant says with enthusiasm, quote, discovered the art of painting, he has certainly painted moving waters, skies, air, and sunlight with a vividness and truth before unknown. Although occasionally painting indoors, he is, in my opinion, most original as an open-air painter, and he has scored his greatest success in that line. Robinson, in this article particularly, but in Giverny, articulated what Monet was after, or at least what Robinson, in his own very intellectual way, believed that Monet was after. And he applies that in his own work. These are two of Robinson's paintings. His idea is that we today, or he at that time, because of how the Impressionists had made painters and how physicists had made everyone in general aware of light, that not only was there such a thing as modern light, but there was such a thing as modern optics, that people at that time actually saw more. That there, if you could train your eye, and if you understood the physics of it, you could actually see more. He said, there is more color in nature than the average observer is aware of. I believe anyone not colorblind can prove for himself by taking the time and trouble to look for it. It is a plausible theory that our forefathers saw fewer colors than we, that they had, in fact, a simpler and more naive vision, that the modern eye is being educated to distinguish a complexity of shades and variety of color before unknown. Modern light. And in this concept of seeing more, the people who came to Giverny, the artists, spend all their time talking about the shadows, the light, the purple, the orange, the technicalities of it all. But underneath it was the understanding that every single one of these artists, no matter how scientifically trained they were not actually seeing the same things, that there was an individuality to it. Each person was able to use their own physiology, the way their eyes were constructed, the way their brain was constructed to perceive color, so that no matter how many people painted the fields of Giverny, like Lillicabet-Perry and Monet, each one of them would be different. Each one of them would find their own individuality. And to prove it, what color is this dress? For those of you who haven't seen this, and I can't believe there is somebody in this room who hasn't seen this before, the issue is this a white dress with a gold trim, or is it a blue dress with a black trim? Now, I can't see, I would have a show of hands. How many people see white and gold? Okay, how many people see blue and black? Okay, right? I mean, what you see is what you see. What you see is what you see. Some people see blue and black, some people see white and gold. And the explanation for this, presumably, is that people have different rods and cones in their eyes. They're actually seeing different colors. Robinson hated Neo-Impressionism, hated Seurat, thought it was ridiculous, thought these were no talent, idiots, called them the fly-speck school of painting. It was because for Robinson, it was all about Monet. And he particularly hated the figure drawing, which, of course, many Americans did think that Seurat's figure drawing was so bizarre, so weird. These almost like they're turned on a lathe. These geometric shapes, cones and cylinders and whatever, that evoke an ancient Egyptian art, an ancient frieze of some sort on a wall, but basically seem like they're the building blocks of reality, made out of simple wooden blocks. But this, too, as far as Seurat was concerned, actually had to do with modern light. Because as physicists continued to study light, what they found was light rays that went beyond the visible spectrum. You can see the visible light on this chart here. And X-rays are here. And there are various forms of X-rays, all on the same spectrum, all on the same electromagnetic spectrum. And it was X-rays that were codified or described and attributed to Wilhelm Röntgen in Germany. But of course, the Americans got in there too. Thomas Edison invented a fluoroscope, which was the first commercially viable X-ray machine, so that you could actually, what you're doing is you're seeing through the visible world into what is underneath, the bones, the structure, peeling back the layers, like Seurat was doing in his geometric figures, seeing underneath the variability of surface visible light. Modern light continues to be examined in the most preposterous ways. Metamaterials and transformation optics have discovered the phenomenon of cloaking, which means, and don't ask me how, that's why I put this explanation up here, which means that light is actually hiding itself. That you can bend the light rays, this is how I understand it, bend the light rays in such a way that they hide the light underneath it. So, the cloak of invisibility, there's an actual physics explanation for this. It is possible through modern physics, through modern understanding of light. So light, from the very beginning, has that, that element of unpredictability, of individuality, of going beyond the surface visible world and digging deeper and creating something new, a new understanding that we relate to abstract art. Even Rude said about wall painting, like, say, the Seurat frieze, or like Mary Cassatt's Modern Woman mural that she did for the 1893 World's Fair, that Rude says if you put paint on a wall, if you create a mural, the paint takes on the character of the wall. It's different from paint on a canvas, which is portable and part of your everyday world. But a wall is something separate, and it is more eternal. So paint on a wall takes on the character of the flatness of the wall. Now, this Mary Cassatt was in the show in Florida, and unfortunately it didn't come here, but I wanted to bring it in anyway to compare it to Robinson's interpretation of the fruit picker theme. Cassatt, having done the mural, having absorbed this idea of the decoration of flatness, has used that for the background and for the skirt, the drawing of the figure. Whereas Robinson is still thinking of an easel painting where the paint is describing reality. Light and color, as far as Rude is concerned, gets to be something very different. He says, it is evident that the positions occupied by color in decoration, that is decoration meaning wall painting, and in painting, that is easel painting, are essentially different. Color being used in the latter, that is easel painting, primarily as a means of accomplishing an end, while in decoration it constitutes to a much greater degree the end itself. The color light is an end in and of itself. It opens the doors to all kinds of what we call abstract art, modern art, Prendergast being a good example in the show. Modern art and Impressionism reaches its peak in the early 20th century in the Armory Show of 1913. It includes all of the American Impressionists. It includes Monet, Renoir, all the French Impressionists. At the same time, it's showing off, for instance, Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, the modern art. And it is at this time that Americans are using Impressionism to talk about the history of modern art as actually an American phenomenon. That, going back to the idea that Monet wasn't appreciated in France, Americans appreciated Monet. Americans appreciate modern art and are open to new ideas. And if you look back at the Statue of Liberty and the idea that light and liberty and modern art are synonymous, we have our answer to the question, is there such a thing as modern light? Thank you.